Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I want to share with you how to make these paper ruffles. So these are a great way to use up paper scraps, and all you need is that paper scrap and you need a sewing machine. Now if you don't have a sewing machine, you could just glue these together, but that would require a lot of glue. So I'd highly recommend sewing them together. Now, here are a few examples that I made with just paper scraps I had on hand, but you can also make these with paper pads. So these are going to fit anybody's style. They're going to fit into journaling, they're going to fit into card making, whatever paper craft you want to use it on, you can use it on. Whatever style you have, you can use it. Just use paper in that style. So the first paper ruffle I'm going to make, I'm going to be pulling from paper pads. Now the great thing about this, you can mix and match. So I have a Julie Nutting Prima paper pad here, and I'm just going to pull out patterns that I like. And then I also have a die cuts with a view that is a basics paper pad. That's a good one to have on hand. And I'll just pull out a few colors that match with it. So in this case, I'll pull some pink and I'll pull some brown. Now mixing and matching is a great way, and if you don't have a full sheet of paper, that's okay. You can just use strips because that's all you need. So once I have my papers picked out, I am going to start cutting these into strips. Now again, this is all going to be on how big you want those paper ruffles to be. So you can go an inch, you can go 1.5 inches if you want to, you can go 1/4 of an inch and have a really, really thin paper ruffle. Just remember, the bigger it is and the smaller it is, so the more extreme you go on both ends, the more difficult it's going to be to work with. So I like to stay in a middle range. I'm cutting these paper strips into 3/4 of an inch. And I normally go from about 1/2 of an inch up to an inch, depending on the project I'm working on. I'm cutting these with my paper trimmer and just quickly throwing them off to the side. I'll sort them out in a bit, or you don't have to if you don't want to. But like I said, I do like to sort mine. That gives me an idea of where I want these to end up as I'm working on sewing these. It makes it go a little bit smoother. So I sort them into piles and then I just start pulling. So I don't have too many blues next to each other. I don't have too many pinks. I don't have too many browns next to each other. I can mix and match. And I just put them into a great big pile. Now the great thing about the paper I am using today, all of it is double-sided. So I have 2 different patterns on both sides. So I can really play around with those patterns and mix them up. You can use one-sided paper. That's not a big deal. And the thickness of the paper is also going to depend on how you fold these too. So if you have a really thick paper, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to fold and to sew through. If it's a really thin paper, it might tear on you. So this is a medium weight paper, just a regular cardstock, probably about 65 pounds, and it's going to sew up really nicely. And when I was picking out my paper, I used it from the paper pad, so all of my paper was the same weight. Now, once I have my stack ready to go, I'm going to start folding these into the ruffles themselves. You can fold this while you sew it, but that takes longer, and I just like to do it ahead of time and get it out of the way. So I'm taking each one of the strips and I am making a little fold in it. So I kind of bring the paper over and on itself, and then I go about maybe 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch away from that fold, and I fold it back. And that's going to create a little ruffle. And I do that all the way down the paper. If you want to make these perfect little ruffles and perfectly straight little bends and folds, use a scoreboard, use a scoring tool. But I'm not going for perfect here, I'm going for fast. So I am just using my fingers to just fold that over and fold it back. I will zoom you in and do a little bit of a slow motion here so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. In this case, it really is easier to see the process than to explain it. So let's slow it down here. I'm going to take my strip of paper and I'm going to bend it and fold it over in on itself. Then about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch away from that fold, I'll bend it back, and that is going to create that little ruffle. Then I'll just continue to do that same process down the entire length of the paper, trying to keep them as evenly spaced as possible. These don't have to be perfect, But like I said, if you do want them perfect, use your scoreboard, use your scoring tool. That will help you. It's also going to help you get really nice folds in the paper. And then just use your bone folder to make sure those are nice and creased into place. Now, once I have all of them folded, it's time to start sewing. Now, there are two ways you can send this through your sewing machine. The way I am starting here, my ruffles are pointing towards the back of the sewing machine. So my folds are more underneath. This is not a great way to send it through. For some reason, if you just flip it around, like I'll show you in a minute, it goes through much, much easier through your sewing machine. Now you can do it this way, but once you get to this end and you start trying to tuck, it gets a little cumbersome and you end up having to put the new end on top. Whereas if you flip it around, you'll get to tuck it under and it creates a really seamless blend between all of your papers. So if you are doing it this way, just realize that you are going to have to send this through your sewing machine. You're going to have to give it a little push first of all. And second of all, whenever you connect your pieces, instead of going underneath, you're going to have to place your new piece on top of your old ruffle fold. It creates a really beautiful look, but it's just a little bit harder to get it through your machine. Now, on the contrary, if you flip it around and you have the ruffles facing you, so that fold is facing you, and you send that through, it just glides right through your sewing machine. And then when you get to the end of one of your ruffles and you go to connect the next one, you get to tuck it into each other. So I take my little fold and I've got my next piece going on and I just tuck that piece that's sticking out right underneath that last fold. And that creates this really seamless blend. Now, if you're going through and maybe your ruffles don't get caught and kind of go underneath like they're supposed to, just lift up your foot, give it a stop, lift up your foot, and just tuck those right underneath, and then it will kind of go back. This is why it's important to have those folds nice and creased so they don't get caught up on the edge of your sewing machine like they are a little bit here. Now, as I'm sewing this, I am using a straight stitch. What size of the stitch, the length of the stitch, and your tension is going to depend on the paper you use and the weight of it. So if you have a really thin paper, you're going to want to make your length a little bit longer and your tension not near as tight because it will rip the paper into shreds and you'll just have a big mess. If you have a thicker paper, you can get away with a closer stitch, so a smaller stitch, and you can get away with keeping your tension a little bit tighter. Also, you can use different stitches. I'm using a straight stitch here, but you can use a zigzag, which I'll show you in a minute. Once you have completely ran through all your papers, you're going to be left with this cute, cute little paper ruffle. Now, I like to roll these up and just kind of keep them with washi tape or something like that and kind of use them like I would washi tape. So here I'll show you an example. I am using an A2 card base, so this is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. If you are new to card making, head over to my blog. I do have a printout for you on how to create all different sizes of card bases. I added a little bit of stenciling with some picked raspberry ink and a TCW stencil. All the supplies I'm using today will be linked down in the description box below. And for this card, I am going for a little bit more of a vintage feel. So I took a piece of craft paper and I just ripped it. And then I cut it down to size. And on those ripped edges, I'm using a little bit of vintage photo distress ink and my ink blending tool to put that on. If you want it a little bit darker and you want it a little bit more differentiated between the background layer and those edges, take your ink pad straight to the paper. But I'm using my ink blending tool and I just glued that down. And now I am going to glue on my paper ruffles with just some double-sided adhesive. And I'm using it just like I would pieces of washi tape. So I've got one row that I glued down and then I cut it off where it met the side of the card. And then I'm putting another piece down. And again, I will just trim that to the side of the card. And there it is. two pieces of the paper ruffles, but they add a lot of texture. They add a lot of color because you're using all those different papers together. And then I'm adding a few little flowers to this. So you could use dried flowers if you wanted to. That would be really pretty. But I am using this Altenew stamp set. It's called Lavender Buds. And I made my lavender buds pink to match the color scheme of this card. And then I'm just tucking a few of those right behind that bottom paper ruffle. Then for a little bit of accent, I am going to add some spray. Now, normally you would spray this through the nozzle, but instead of like a pearl or a gem or something like that, I wanted to add a little bit of messiness, like a paint splatter to it. Sprays are a really good thing to have on hand for that. You can use this kind I'm using here, which are fireworks. You can use oxides. You can use distress spray stains. Lindy's Stamping Gang has some sprays that are really beautiful. A lot of different companies, and you can mix and match and just take off the top and spray those on or kind of flick them on. And then I did add a few pearls and gems to this to finish it off. But those paper ruffles are kind of the star of the show. I also added a little thanks sentiment to finish that card off. That one's probably my favorite, but I do have a few more examples to show you. So on our last card, we just did one ruffle and ran it through with a bunch of different papers and kind of mixed and matched. But if you want to, you can create a matching ruffle and you can layer them up. So here I am using two different papers. These are from a My Favorite Things paper pack. And so they coordinate really well together. I love using paper packs for this just because I'm not the best at matching them up. So if I grab from one pack, I know they all match each other. So on that first, which is going to be my top layer, I cut it at 1/2 inch. And then my bottom layer, which is going to be this blue or teal paper, I am cutting it to 3/4 of an inch. So it's just a little bit wider. And I'll separate these into two piles. I'm going to be folding them exactly the same way like I showed you before, just folding them over, and I'm not connecting them at all. I'm folding each paper separately. I'm folding each kind of paper separately, and I'll sew them together as so. So here I'm just folding them one over the top of each other just like I did before, and I'll do that on this rainbow plaid paper first, and I'll set those off to the side, and then I'll do the exact same process on those teal ones. Now, because these are close in size, you're not going to need much more of one than the other. If you go super large on one and really small on the other, you're going to need more of the larger one than you are the smaller one, just because the ruffles spread out more, so you have more ground to cover with those larger ruffles. Now, once I have both folded up, I'm going to put these through my sewing machine. Now, I'm going to do these separately. So you could, by all means, start layering these now and sewing them both together. I am very, very new to sewing. That's a little bit too much for me to handle. And I didn't want any kind of adhesive kind of holding these together as I sewed. So I'm going to first start with my bottom layer, which is that teal layer. And I'm going to put these through my sewing machine. I'm using white thread here. You could use matching thread, or you could use a really contrast color of thread to go through here. I used white because I didn't have to switch it between these. That's the only reason. So I went ahead and used a straight stitch, and I am keeping this stitch right in the center. Again, just like you can use different stitches, you can use the placement of your stitch. You can stitch it once, come back through, stitch it again, go a little wonky with it. It doesn't have to be straight. You can go crooked. It really is just about playing with it and finding your style. So I'll continue to send this teal through until I have all of my paper stitched together. And just like before, once I get close to the end, I am just tucking on my new piece right underneath, so it creates a really, really seamless ruffle, especially when you're using the same paper. Now I'm going to switch to a zigzag stitch. To check to make sure it's the kind I want and it's the look I want, I test it on a scrap piece of paper first or a scrap piece of fabric, and then I come in and start sewing these together. Now, I am going to go ahead and take my next piece, my top piece, which is the rainbow plaid, and I'm going to layer that right on top. You can take your ruffles the same direction, which is what I'm doing, or you can flip them around. Again, just about playing around with it. You can really make these your own. I'm going to keep mine going the same direction, and I'll go ahead and just start off by placing these down and using my presser foot to hold that in place. Then, using my zigzag stitch, I am going to stitch down this top piece. And just like before, I am treating it just like its own separate ruffle. Just at the same time I am putting those ruffles together, I'm stitching it onto that bottom layer. Like I said, by all means, if you are a sewer and you've been doing it for years and you can handle those layers, do it in one. I can't, so I did it in two. Now, if you go too far and you don't have room to stick this underneath and kind of push them together, just lift your presser foot up for a second. It helps if the needle is down so it holds it in place. And then just pop your paper right underneath it, section them together, press your presser foot down or put it down, and then continue to sew just like you would. Again, I'm doing a zigzag stitch here right on top. And because I'm doing the zigzag stitch right over that straight stitch, it's not going to get caught up or blend together. And it's also not going to start ripping the paper. So if I was to do another straight stitch right on top of this other stitch, that might be a little bit too much for the thickness of this paper. And it might start ripping and kind of just tearing in half. This isn't like sewing fabric where you have those other layers holding it together, that kind of interwoven fabric. With this, once you break those fibers of the paper, they just kind of fall apart. So just be aware of that as you go to sew this. And know that sometimes they might fall apart and that's okay. So here is what this one looked like. I absolutely adore this. I'm going to use this on a birthday card. So all I did to finish this off was just put a piece of embossed craft cardstock on the bottom, and then using foam tape, I'm going to pop this up, give it a little bit more dimension, and I'm just placing that piece of paper ruffle that I made down onto the foam tape, and then I'll trim it off with my scissors. Now the great thing about using the double-sided adhesive and the foam tape, it kind of holds it all together. So if you do have a thread that starts to unravel, that adhesive just grabs onto it and it's not going to let it go anywhere. To finish this card, I just added a little celebrate right on top in the top right hand corner with some black ink. And that is it for this card. There are so many variations on this technique, and these are just a few of them. You can double it up, you can do 2 ruffles, or like I'm going to show you in just a moment, you can do 1 ruffle on top of just plain cardstock like I did in this next card. Now I'm not going to show you the process again, but I did use some glitter paper on this one. And I used the same process, but instead of putting that paper ruffle on top of another paper ruffle, I put it on top of just plain cardstock and use that as my paper ruffle. Now, on this one, I use glitter cardstock. That is one last tip I want to give you. Use different kinds of cardstock, but understand that not all of them are going to play nice with your sewing machine. I used a glitzy glitter paper here. If you use a chunky glitter paper, that's probably not going to, your sewing machine isn't going to love that. So just be aware, so many companies are coming out with different kinds of paper. Be aware they're not all going to play nice with your sewing machine. So if you're scared, stick to your regular paper. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you give this technique a try. It really is a lot of fun, whether you're a card maker, a journaler, a scrapbooker, so many different uses for this. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget the supplies are listed in the description box below, and happy crafting.